This episode of Simulation Nation is brought to you by Avkin Incorporated, your one-stop shop for everything wearable simulator and standardized patient.
Well, Wayne, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. I really was excited when I read your article on hybrid simulation and wearable simulators, the systematic review. I know it came out in 2020, and it wasn't something that I came across, but it was put on my desk a few weeks ago, and we just have been very excited about all the work that you've done. But I wondered if you could spend a few minutes introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about how you got interested in healthcare simulation, because I don't think that was probably what you aspired to do when you were getting into your professional career. But I'm very interested and very curious as to what you do on an everyday basis and what really inspired this.
Sure. So my first venture into schooling, I did an associate degree in electronics technology.
Okay.
So that right away gave me a technology background. And I worked in that for quite a while. And one of the jobs I had, in fact, was a biomedical technologist working in a hospital, repairing defibrillators and things like that. And then from there, I actually went into teaching. And I started teaching at a college, teaching electronics. And so I thought, well, maybe I should go back to school. So I went back to school and I did a bachelor's degree in adult education. And I kept teaching and was teaching for quite a while. So I went back to school again and did a master's in distance education. And I was transferred schools. I was teaching electronics, still electrical in college. And then I decided to move over to computer science. So I went back to school again and did a master's degree in computer science, which allowed me to then start teaching computer science. So now we have this, I guess, blending of these two fields, electronics and computer science, which is, really mechatronics, where the world is heading. And my supervisor for my master's degree in computer science, he encouraged me to do a PhD. And I did my master's with Athabasca University in Alberta, Canada. And so he encouraged me to do a PhD, and he was associated or is associated with the University of Eastern Finland. And so I applied there to do a master or do a PhD in computer science. And what inspired this research, because even though I study at the University of Eastern Finland, I live in Canada, just north of Toronto. And what inspired this research was I took a teaching position with a college here in Ontario. And during the first week of work, we had an onboarding session. And in that onboarding session, we toured the college. And one of the tours was of the high fidelity simulator lab, because we teach at our college, we teach nursing and pharmacy and, many health fields, And one of the new hires with me was hired to teach nursing in a satellite campus. And she was just commenting, I guess, as we were going through our tour, that these high fidelity simulators, these mannequins that they were showing us, which were, I think the tour guide said maybe $80,000 or $90,000 each. She was commenting that in her satellite campus, they don't have this same budget, and they have to come up with a simulator, with off the shelf things, just kind of cobble things together. And a light bulb went on. I thought, surely, with a background in electronics and a background in computer science, surely there must be a way to put together a simulation that's fairly inexpensive, but yet very practical for this particular scenario. So that's kind of what had me end up in this field of hybrid simulation.
Yeah. I think that it's obviously very different life paths for us, but in the same way, I had very similar experience. We had the mannequins, but then I kept saying, there's got to be a better way. They're not going to take care of plastic people when they get to the hospital. There's got to be a better way. And so, of course, I started with standardized patients and then said, well, how can I make them sicker without cutting holes in their neck?
Yeah,
We're
exactly.
sticking them with needles. And so that really kind of came out of the idea of how can I increase the use of live people, because I wanted the skills that I was teaching them to transfer into the clinical setting. It was so important to me.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I still wanted to be able to, you know, stretch the students to the edges of their ability. Nicole Harden from Canada, also that's her quote. I always say it, but I love it because you don't want. I always tell the students, if I give you a softball, it's not very helpful. But if I give you a really hard fastball or a screwball, you're going to have a really hard time with it. So I need to give it to you right in the middle so that you are stretched, but you're not so stretched that you're stressed out and not learning. So, but I think it's very interesting. So can you tell me a little bit more about, I'm assuming you're doing this work for your PhD?
That's correct.
Yeah. So can you tell me a little bit more about the metamorphosis of the systematic review that you did? Like, can you tell us a little bit more about, how did,
The journey, shall we say?
yes, the journey. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, as I said earlier, the primary focus initially was, can we use technology to put together a simulation which is effective,
Mm-hmm.
which can be used, which is practical, which can help students meet learning outcomes,
Right.
which can help students build confidence, the things
Right.
we want our students to do.
Right.
And, that was kind of the initial kernel of thought. And so we start with a systematic literature review.
Mm-hmm.
And what we found in that literature review was that hybrid simulation was alive and well. There was a lot of things happening in the areas of hybrid simulation, and that hybrid simulation with a standardized patient, because we can have hybrid simulation without a standardized patient,
Mm-hmm.
but hybrid simulation with a standardized patient was, from the literature, was particularly effective,
Mm-hmm.
simply because of the standardized patient. The standardized patient, a human actor, just brings so much to the simulation. And I'll tell one story. I'm fast forwarding, and then I'll go back again.
Okay.
We did a couple of field trials, and in one of the field trials, our students were personal support workers. So they would be healthcare workers who care primarily for seniors.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the very common health scenarios they come into is congestive heart failure.
Mm-hmm.
Many of their clients end up in congestive heart failure during a shift. And so working with the instructor, we put together a simulation, and we felt that congestive heart failure would be a good focus for that simulation. And we hired a professional actor, which is not necessary. The literature, for example, gives many different examples of using students, which has advantages. One research study I read, the professors used actors from the drama department in the same university.
Mm-hmm.
And that was incredibly effective and
Yes.
and so beneficial to both parties.
Mm-hmm.
The research showed how the actors actually learned about healthcare, but they also learned empathy for the patient. They learned empathy for the worker. And they also showed indication that they understood better how to be an advocate for the patient. So many benefits came out
Yeah.
of the use of a standardized patient. In this context, someone who was in the university already. So anyway, back to my story. We hired a professional actor. So she was very good. She was a professional. And we gave her the cues that we would give her a cue, and she would act in a particular way based on the cue. One of the cues was a sudden need to void, a sudden need to go to visit the facilities. So we were in the middle of the simulation, and we gave her this cue. And so, she sat up and she said, I've got to use the washroom. And everyone, all the students and the instructor thought, oh, okay, so let's take a break from the simulation and just let her go to the washroom. It was so realistic.
Yeah.
It was unbelievable. The realism, that came from the actor. So, sorry, I'll go back. We did a systematic literature review, and we saw that standardized patients had incredible benefit, mostly in two areas. One in the area of realism and fidelity, and the other in the area of communication. One researcher I read said that when students were working in a simulation with a mannequin, their interactions were very rote and were met the minimum of the rubric for that assessment. So they might have said the words, okay, I'm going to give you a needle now, but that's because that's what the learning outcomes required of them. So there was no empathy in their voice. There was no, it was very rote.
Yeah.
And, the literature talks about how instead of a mannequin, if we have a standardized patient, because the standardized patient can give feedback, can look at someone and can talk, of course, and can shiver and do these types of things.
Yeah.
The conversation is completely different. It's much more natural. It's much more real.
Yeah.
And isn't that what simulation is about? Realism.
Yes.
Right.
Yep. And transferability to the clinical setting. Right. So if you can, if you can transfer your learning, that's the huge benefit. I mean, I can't tell you how many times when I was using the mannequins early on, and they would say, well, if it was a real person, I would have said that, or I would have done that. And whenever I'm out speaking about this and I say that, they're all like, yeah, they always say that. And I always felt as if it just took all the air out of the learning experience, because they really did. I couldn't say that it was a real person, I mean, obviously in pre-briefing, we would tell them, but I worried that it was going to that the negative empathy or the lack of empathy was going to transfer into a clinical setting. I mean, not that I saw it personally myself, but it was because we weren't reinforcing that in simulation. What are they going to take with them into a clinical setting? So we know communication is 80% or 90% nonverbal. So having a live person makes all the difference in the world.
Makes all the difference. And, the other thing we found in the literature was there was, a fair number of examples of hybrid simulation using standardized patients. And we found that these hybrid simulations were focused on a particular scenario. That's great. And so I began to think, I wonder, because if I go back to this onboarding week, this instructor who, was comparing her world in a satellite campus to the world of the main campus that had a significantly larger budget. What I began to think about was, okay, can we put together a hybrid simulation with a standardized patient that's simple, that's inexpensive, but also it's generic enough or flexible enough that this instructor can use it for maybe 5 or 6 different scenarios.
Mm.
Or maybe the instructor in the dental faculty could use it. Or maybe the instructor in the firefighting faculty could use it. So we have, many different faculties. So then, okay, so now we had to step back again and think about a theoretical framework, because there wasn't one in that we found in the literature, a context in which to build this simulation. And so one of the papers we published and delivered at a conference in India was the theoretical framework behind this hybrid simulation, where we use standardized patients and off-the-shelf technology. Because again, our thought was, oftentimes, in my experience, faculty do not have the technical support they need 10 minutes before class begins when something goes wrong to get help or to even build this simulation in the first place, except if you're in a school that has a significant budget. And remember, the context of my thinking was around this school with a very little budget, a satellite campus. And so my thinking was beginning to focus around off-the-shelf technology. And I was, as I'm chatting to colleagues, having, background in computer science and languages and programming, my very initial thought was, I've got to write the software for this. But then as I talked to colleagues and did some research, it was, no, it's already out there. You just got to find what's out there and use it so that you keep it simple. And so we ended up building a theoretical framework. And then that theoretical framework was the context in which we built 2 different field simulations to test the theoretical framework to conclude, does it appear to be effective? Like, do students appear, or can students meet learning outcomes? Do students feel more confident because of the intervention of the simulation? And that became the focus of our research.
Yeah, interesting. And so when you say off the shelf technology, now obviously the products that we created at Avkin are considered high fidelity wearable simulators, right? And so yours are more of a, hey, let's find what we can use in the industry that's already out there and not recreate the wheel, make it more affordable, which I think all of us would love to hear how that happens, right? Because in simulation, moulage, we're all talking about how to make intestines, in the abdomen, make them look realistic so that when they, lift the shirt, they see that the patient's been eviscerated or whatever. So, the idea of sharing ideas of kind of the grassroots pieces of this is something that they actually have a website on the National League for Nurses, SimConnect. I think it's SimConnect. The simulation site for National League for
Sounds
Nurses.
right.
But it's called grassroots, like the things that you can do, in a very affordable way.
Yes.
And, so was it something that was changing the lung sounds of the person that was wearing or
Right.
using the actor?
So let me kind of walk through maybe the theoretical framework, and that I think will speak to what you're asking.
Now, did you publish on this theoretical framework?
I did.
You did. So
Yeah.
The article that I saw, the Hybrid Simulation Systematic Review, was an open access article. Is that one not open access?
It should be open. It should be open access. Yeah.
Okay.
I can send you.
We will definitely put this in the comments for anybody that wants to access both articles of this, and learn more about all the work that you've done. But yeah, if you could explain quickly, and then we can learn a little bit about it. If they want to learn more, we'll get into the article on that one for sure.
Okay. In the theoretical framework, we stepped back and asked, what does a simulation accomplish? What does it do? What does the literature tells us that it accomplishes? And really, it came down to, when you are doing a simulation in healthcare education, we have a student, we have a patient, and the student gets information, and based on that information, they, enact some level of care, an
Yep.
intervention.
Make clinical decisions.
Yeah, or make decisions, or draw conclusions, escalate to another medical professional, whatever. But all of this requires data for them. I'm thinking in computer science. It's about the data.
Accurate data.
So then we thought, okay, well, what is that data? And what we came up with in our theoretical framework, in the context of a standardized patient, remember, hybrid, is, let's break this data into 4 categories or channels. One channel of data is the general acting theme of the actor. So when we did, for example, congestive heart failure, we talked to the actor and we told the actor that, look, you're in congestive heart failure, so generally speaking, you should be showing signs of fatigue. You should, if you are asked, you should talk about maybe a history of heart problems in your family, these types of things. So that's the general acting theme. So that was one category of channel of information that the student hopefully takes in and assimilates. The second channel of information then is specific acting cues, like having to use the washroom on very short notice, or sitting up in bed and coughing. Okay, so this is another channel of communication, but now we need to cue the actor. So this is where the wearable technology comes in. We tried 2 different approaches. One approach is we used a Wi-Fi enabled microcontroller, and it was attached to a vibration motor, and this was attached to the actor's arm. It was connected to the control computer via Bluetooth. And so we were able to activate that vibration motor remotely from the computer. And, we agreed that if you felt one vibration, that was Q1, 2 vibrations is Q2. So we gave our actor 4 different cues for this particular scenario. So let me pause there. Can you see already how we have some flexibility? We could come up with a new scenario with 4 completely different cues. The technology is the same.
Yep.
All that's changed is our briefing notes with the actor. Okay, you're not in congestive heart failure. Now there's something else going on with you, and here's generally how you act for this. High blood pressure, and here's the 4 things that you should do based upon the cues. So that was 2 channels of information. The third channel of information, we said, should come from audio. So what we did was we had pre-recorded wave files of an escalated heart rate. And again, we used a very simple technology. We used Bluetooth earbuds. So simple. We all own them. So you just connect them to the computer. You have a wave file on the computer. We placed the earbuds underneath the patient's clothing at the heart position. And we tuned the audio such that you couldn't hear it unless you were wearing a stethoscope. So if during this scenario, the student decides, I should listen to this patient's heart to, is there something going on here? We can then play this audio file.
Gotcha.
So now we've got 3 channels of information, all of which are very generic, very flexible. I could have played any type of sound that is relative to the simulation. And as I'm sure you're aware, many of these sounds are, you can just pick them up online. They're just available.
Yeah, when you get to be our level, you have to license them. But I understand at a grassroots level, you can find something that's what the instructor is going to want for that particular simulation, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the fourth channel. So we had, in our theoretical framework, we had 4 channels of information, or 4 categories of information. The last channel of information was what we see in most hospitals, maybe all hospitals, is the bedside monitor. And again, we use off-the-shelf technology, so it was easy. So we put a tablet next to the bedside. We used a free online website editor, and we essentially created a website that looked like a bedside monitor. So
Gotcha.
it wasn't a website to sell anything. It looked like a bedside monitor. And then we set up the control computer such that the editor for that website was available to us in real time. So as the simulation progressed, we could change what was being displayed on the website in real time. Now we had to play around with it a bit, because in order for the website to change, it needs to be refreshed. Again, instead of going through the trouble of writing the code to do that, we just found a plugin for Google that automatically refreshes your web page every increment, 10 seconds, 30 seconds.
Nice.
So we just downloaded this plugin to Google, and it refreshed every 30 seconds. We had this real-time editor, and as the simulation progressed, we could change the heart rate. We could change the blood pressure. We could change whatever we wanted to whatever we wanted. And again, you see the flexibility in this. I could put things on the bedside monitor. I can change what's on the bedside monitor. I can put 5 things on the bedside monitor. I can put 2, depending on the scenario I'm trying to simulate.
Yeah. So the first 2 things you described are really subjective, right? It's what the patient is saying or what the patient is doing is subjective data. And then the other 2 that you're describing are objective, right? Where they're actually gathering data that they've learned, from their clinical judgment. But the idea is that they're bringing all this information in, formulating hypothesis. The National Council of State Boards of Nursing has a, kind of a nursing process formula. So the cues, the idea of the cues in there. So there's cues that, inform hypothesis. They test the hypothesis. They perform an intervention or, assessment, or as you said, like to a higher authority. And then, they go back and reassess the patient, all the things that so it's very interesting to see how you're describing it, because it is very nursing process oriented in the approach, which I assume because your background isn't nursing. I don't know if you knew that, but probably the nursing instructor was working with you on this at the same time. Is that correct?
Well, there's a couple of things going on. As I said, I used to work in a hospital, but on the technical side.
Right.
So I was the technician who would repair the defibrillator when it was broken.
When it was yanked out of the wall without being careful about the plug.
That's right.
Yes.
But yes, I was working with a nursing instructor. But then as an added bonus, my wife is a nurse. So
okay. There you go.
All the time.
Right. I'm sure. Yeah. I was asked to write a paramedic simulation, and I'm a nurse, right? So I would go to my husband, who is a paramedic, and be like, does this sound good?
Exactly.
Like, yeah, that's right.
Yeah. But, yes, I've had some exposure to nursing, but, not enough to make me a healthcare expert.
Sure.
So really, I approach this from a computer science perspective.
Right.
But as you said, it just lines up. It just makes sense.
Yeah.
So,
well, I want to give you a chance to finish your theory before I ask you the next question. Is it fairly complete with that part of it?
Yeah. So the 4 channels of communication are the key. And then we have, if there is a diagram, obviously, but then there's the feedback loop that, okay, what can we do different in our simulation? Does it help us meet help the students meet learning outcomes,
Right.
those types
Right.
of things. So,
Gotcha. Okay,
yeah.
great. Well, I can't wait to see that article. But one of the very interesting things is, they say that if a nurse and an engineer get together, they can accomplish amazing things. And for me personally, that was the same way, right? Where I had a very robust standardized patient program, very similar to what you're describing, with the theater department being involved, and just it was a course, and the students that were taking the course were typically pre-med or theater, but both. But they all would write these self-reflections that were just so incredibly amazing. But then I wanted to be able to make them sicker, like, how could I do this? And so we were advised to talk to the engineering department. And then that's really where the wearable simulators began to transform. The students that created the very first tracheostomy simulator that we
Yep.
made were seniors. They're the undergraduate seniors. It was mechanical, electric engineers, and biomedical engineers. They all worked together on a team, and the nursing students and the theater students helped with, how realistic it was and stuff. But it was the idea of, like, if I think a lot of times nurses were pretty creative people. We can come up with, again, if you go to that website, there's lots of ideas of moulage and different types of things that you can do to make those simulations more realistic and authentic. But we don't really necessarily have the resources or know how to apply that, right? It's like, if I could just have, and so I think it's beautiful, the whole idea or the whole concept of someone who has a technology background and has an experience with, even with computer science, and the idea of how can we do these things, taking that skill and knowledge and working with, an educator in this case, but even a nurse on a floor somewhere is just like, it would be so much easier if we just had this. That's where really great things can happen. So again, it's
Mhm.
really, amazing to hear all the work that you've done in this. And you've had to learn a lot, I'm sure, along the way. This is a growth process. So are you done with your PhD now, or are you still in the process of gathering your PhD, finishing?
I'm very, very close. I've published 4 papers to date, and am in the midst of putting together the final dissertation and
Wow.
defense. So maybe in the next 6 months,
Yeah.
I'll be finished.
Well, congratulations to you. Again, I think I don't want to say that other PhDs aren't worthwhile. They're all worthwhile, but it's something that, again, from my perspective, it's so near and dear that somebody has heard someone just kind of randomly in an orientation said, I think I can fix this, or I think I can help you. Um, and that's just really exciting. I think the idea of, even as you said, like, okay, so we have one patient that has congestive heart failure, but the patient could be in the middle of congestive heart failure, or maybe it's a new diagnosis of heart failure and they need to get educated. There's a lot about interprofessional simulation, the idea of having a nutritionist be a part of that simulation and help them in their education about a low salt diet and the impact of that, those types
Mhm.
of things. Where even with social work, do they have someone at home to help them? Are they, if they're not in a care home? But I think that it's, the idea is that you can take these simulations so many different places. And we, I think in simulation, we commonly do that. They call them evolving sims, where they evolve from, maybe needing just a little bit of care to where it's, progressively worse. And then maybe the last one is end of life by the time they're seniors, or even scaffolded, right? Where
Mhm.
you're bringing in more and more complexity to the patient. So there is a case for that. But I do think, the same as you said, the technology can be utilized in very unique ways um, that extend the integration, or just with a slight change now add a level of complexity that will stretch the student from semester 1. Now they're in semester 2. Okay, let's stretch them to the edges of their ability in that level as well. So great. Again, I think all the things that you're talking about, I'm like, yep, exactly what he said. In agreement on that. And I think that have when you hired this actor to do this work, was it at the satellite campus that you had first met the nursing instructor during orientation, or was it a different place?
We did go to a satellite campus, not the same one. We went to
Okay.
another satellite campus. So the nursing instructor I work with was, quite enthused and excited about this idea
I bet she
of
was.
having this flexibility and
Yeah.
and realism in her simulations. And, as you do these field trials, interesting stories come out, and it's the stories that often have a message behind them. One of the interesting stories, we talked at the beginning of this webcast about high fidelity simulators versus using standardized patients and wearable technologies. And high fidelity simulators are expensive, they're mechanical, maybe even complex. And so in one of the field trials, once the simulation was completed, we did a focus group to understand what the students were thinking, what they were feeling. And the room we chose, there was, like a couch in there and chairs or whatever. So I sat on the couch, but there was something behind me that was kind of in the way, covered up with a blanket. And so I said to the instructor, can we move this? And she said, yes, no problem. And when she moved it, it was under a blanket. When she moved it, it was not a high fidelity simulator, but maybe a desktop simulator.
Okay.
They just weren't using it. Mm-hmm. It was just covered up in a blanket, thrown on the couch because it was too complicated. It was mechanical. And so they literally weren't using it. And it kind of made me chuckle that's part of what we're talking about here. There's a place for high fidelity simulators, no doubts. They can do things that we can't do yet. But in this scenario, it just struck me as funny that, this somewhat high fidelity simulator was shelved, if you will, and just covered up with a blanket and not being used.
Well, and that's not unique to the industry. It did take a while for, a lot of people got grant money to purchase these simulators in the early 2000s as they were coming out, and they would get them out and then start to read the user's manual and really have a hard time and be like, okay, we'll put that away for another day. And some of them never really were used very well. That was one of the things when we were creating these, I would always say, they have to be intuitive for a nurse, because that's typically who's going to be utilizing the products, is someone that's in nursing. And it can't be such high fidelity that, it's over technology, where you're trying to just figure out. The very first simulator we got was from one of the mannequin companies, and it was all based on physiology. So if you wanted to raise the blood pressure, you couldn't just even click tick 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 up. You had to think about adding fluid volume into the simulator. Now it's improved over time, but it was one of those things of, in the middle of a simulation, I just want to be able to put a number in, and that's what it is, and be able to change it quickly. And it didn't go that way for us. But again, it's gotten better. It's a lot better than it was before. But, I think that technology is like the right amount is so important to think about.
Yeah. And, when I was doing the systematic literature review, I began to do some research on the cost of a high fidelity simulator. And, one of the things we saw was the total cost of ownership is much, much greater than the cost of the simulator. You talk about the owner's manual being so large. What we found was a lot of large universities hire a full-time simulator technician.
Yeah.
So that's overhead. If you really are going to do it well, you're going to have a simulation control room. So now that's real estate that's filled with equipment, and the total cost of ownership was significantly greater than the individual cost of the simulator itself.
Yeah. The warranties, that's another big one that's mentioned, the cost of the warranties to keep the upkeep and things along those lines. Yeah. No. Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's one of the things when people say, well, I can't afford to pay a standardized patient. I always say, if you, and actually I didn't say it, Kim Leighton, who is very, very well influential in simulation, she said, if you never bought the mannequin and you never paid for the warranties, the amount of payment that you could use to pay a standardized patient is going to be way less at the end of 4 or 5 years when you would purchase another mannequin. And I never thought about it that way, even though I love standardized patients. I never considered it that way, but it is, because you are also adding to your budget other things, right? And you're also considering, I was in Minnesota, I believe, and they said, well, you also have to add in the fact that they go down, that they go offline at least once a day, usually twice, and it takes half an hour to get them back online. And I thought, I never, because I used them just for a short period of time till I started to really get into standardized patients. I never realized how hard it was. Ours were direct connect, so we didn't have the problem, but now with it being Wi-Fi enabled, it lost it. And I heard you say that you used Bluetooth, which is actually what the technology that our products use, because it is so much more reliable, and you don't have to worry about 10 inch or 12-inch cement blocks that are between you and the actual simulation room. So that has been a big consideration for us too, just because of the experiences that we've had in talking to other people. Did you all do anything as far as diversity education with standardized patients in the wearables? Was that anything that you guys got involved with within your research, or was that outside the bounds of what you were doing?
Yeah, that was outside the bounds of what we were doing. That wasn't an area that we had touched on at all.
Gotcha. And you really focused your research on the nursing aspect, not medicine or other disciplines, correct?
That's correct. We used a convenience sample of students, and when I did my field trials, we were in the midst of the pandemic, so we had a number of challenges. The regulations at the time, where I was, which was in Ontario, Canada, was that in an education setting, we were not allowed to have no more than 10 people in a room, or at least 10 people in the room of the size we used. And so, you had the principal researcher, you had the technician, and the instructor. So that's 3. So we could only have 7. And then you had the actor, so that's 4. So we could only have 6 students in the room.
Right.
So we had some interesting challenges from that, but the students who were available were from this particular faculty, and so that's the faculty we focused on. However, when you step back and say, okay, what's next? What future research could it look like? One of the elements or aspects that we want to look at is how effective is this theoretical framework in other faculties? How effective is it in nursing, in medicine, in paramedic training? Almost pick any healthcare area. And because we've built it so flexible, we're confident that it could be utilized in many different faculties for many different simulations, because of the flexibility of these 4 channels of information.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and I mean, again, if you think about it, in healthcare, no matter what discipline you are, that is you still have to take in that information. And again, you may want to modify it, but you have that flexibility to modify it. And, again, traditionally in simulation, there's either 3 or 4 phases. So as you design these cues, a funny story with that one, as I used to do before we had, we have something very similar to the way you described the vibrations. We have an AV band that has vibrations, but before we even had that, this was very early on. I can remember telling the student or the SP, I'm going to text you at a certain point, and I'm going to break up with you, and that's the cue that you need to have a change of heart, right? So it was as if it was the same idea or the same concept. We had one where it was a patient who was having terrible chest pain, and we had put Tic Tacs in little packaging that looked like nitroglycerin. And we said, when they put the nitroglycerin under your tongue, you are to go unconscious. And obviously in the pre-briefing, we told them, okay, the patient's going to go unconscious, then you're going to move over to the mannequin, because we certainly don't want them doing CPR on our SP. So that was,
Yeah.
we had to, that one we had to be a little bit more direct with. They didn't know when the patient was going to pass out, but the patient knew when the nitroglycerin went under the tongue. That was when. So that you can build these things in, and that allows the simulation to progress at the right time,
Yeah.
because we want for the one patient who we were sending the breakup message to, we wanted them to get all the way through the cage questionnaire until we did that. And we didn't expect the standardized patient to know that, because they were the patient, and they were taking in and answering questions the way, as you said, with the way it was built out for them. And so we wanted it, as the instructor, we knew when those questions had been asked, and we would send the breakup message, and then they knew what to do. But it is one of those things where you can change that simulation based off of the information if you have just a few pieces in there that give you that flexibility. And I think a big thing that we've heard as we've been out there in the visiting places and hearing what they're doing is, oh, well, we want to make sure it's standardized. And so we've been helping people even with making sure that, if you don't have the same person that's doing it time after time, and that comes from my experience, because we were including the students as our standardized patients from other disciplines, and they would be coming from class. So sometimes they could come and only do 2 hours, but we needed 4 hours. So
Yes.
one student would come for the first 2 hours, and then the other student would come for another 2. And we built into where, they would have time to observe each other, and they went through the dress rehearsal together and things like that. But, there's ways to make sure that those SPs are standardized. And I think in some ways more than the mannequins, because if the mannequins die in the middle of a simulation accidentally by going offline, now they're like, what do we do now? So, there's ways to do that. And, we certainly are a resource at Avkin to help them with that. But I appreciate all of your hard work on this. I'm really excited. Now, you mentioned a little bit about the idea of taking this to other disciplines. My last question for you is, where do you really see the future of healthcare simulation with the wearables and standardized patients going? Like, what do you imagine it to be?
What I see is adding more and more technology to the standardized patient, so that we get to, and a lot of your research has pushed us in that direction. We get to the place where the fidelity, the realism is extremely high, even in a complex scenario, such that the student can walk away feeling that they've participated in a real scenario. And the lines between reality and simulation blur. There's, mention of this in the literature. A number of researchers would mention this idea that the lines begin to blur as you're in these simulations, if they're done well. And the example I gave you of everyone pausing the simulation, they were so caught up in it that they didn't even know that this was part of simulation. They thought the actor really had to go to the washroom. Another story I have like that is when we did the focus group after the simulation was over. We were sitting down and kind of getting ready to do the focus group, and I was facilitating. And I noticed one of the students who had participated in the simulation just seemed quite quiet and speaking to another student. And so I asked, is everything okay? Are you ready to begin? And it turned out that this student had a relative who went into congestive heart failure, like just not too many days prior to the simulation. And the simulation was so realistic that it brought back all this emotion to this student, that she needed time to gather herself before she could even participate in the focus group.
Yeah.
It was fascinating.
Yeah. And you don't think about something like congestive heart failure necessarily being a potential trigger, right? Because it's typically not, like if you think about suicidality or, eating disorders or things along those lines, it could be a potential trigger. But even with a simulation that's so realistic, it can. And I think the idea that, you were sensitive to the fact that the student may need a few minutes to gather themselves. I think that that's, again, in simulation, that's what we are taught to do, is to be sensitive to that, and, you know, to make sure that everybody feels as though they're safe and that they have a safe place to make mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody was talking to me the other day of like, well, do we avoid these potential triggering simulations? And I said, but what better place to learn it is in simulation, so that you do have time to talk about your own feelings, thoughts, and emotions. How do you, you know, your personal life and your professional life, how do you blend them but keep them separate? You know, how, you know, again, if it's something that is a potential trigger for a particular student, better for them to find out there, because maybe that's, you know, maybe that's not the area of nursing that they're going to go into, because it may evoke those emotions.
Mm-hmm.
But simulation is meant to be a safe place and give you that opportunity to talk about it at the end with the debriefing or focus group, as you were mentioning. But it is one of those things where with an SP, because of the realism, it does, you know, it does potentially trigger some things, and we have to be sensitive to that. But at the same time, to avoid it does not mean that they're not going to encounter it in a clinical setting. So what better place to learn it and be able to debrief on it than in an actual simulation, and where there are people there that are trained to help with psychological safety and debrief on it as well.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, great. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate all the time that you invested into this. And again, I as a fellow nurse who, you know, had limited resources, appreciate the fact that you heard the cry and said, hey, I think I can work on this. I think I can help. That's really, again, that synergy between technology, engineering, nursing. That's really where I think healthcare is going to make massive improvements down the line. So thanks again for hearing the cry of help and responding and putting your PhD work into this. I mean, that's a lot of time that you've invested. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.